The hardest part of watching someone you love weigh your worth on a scale is not the anger. It is the profound, echoing silence that follows. Late autumn winds battered the high stone walls of the Romano estate, carrying the bitter salt of the northern sea. Inside the grand dining room, the atmosphere was suffocatingly still. The expansive space felt less like a sanctuary and more like a glass cage, illuminated by the cold, fractured light of a massive crystal chandelier. Vivienne Romano stood at the head of the long mahogany table. Her fingers traced the edge of a heavy silver centerpiece, gently aligning its base with the intricate grain of the wood. The metal bit into her skin, freezing to the touch. It was a small, invisible act of care, a quiet attempt to impose order on a room that rarely offered her any genuine warmth. She adjusted a stray white orchid, ensuring the symmetry was absolute before the evening meal. Footsteps echoed against the marble corridor outside. Measured, deliberate, lacking any trace of hesitation. Donna Camilla Romano crossed the threshold. The matriarch wore her usual evening uniform of charcoal cashmere and heavy pearls, her posture rigidly upright. She did not offer a greeting. She did not even glance at the younger woman standing near the floral arrangement. Instead, the older woman carried a thick, dark object pressed firmly against her side. Vivienne's hands stilled on the silver dish. It was the family ledger. The ancient leather-bound book contained generations of bloodlines, syndicate debts, and strategic political alliances. It was a physical record of cold survival. Normally, the heavy volume resided inside a locked steel vault beneath the main study. Bringing it into the dining room was an intentional, calculated violation of domestic peace. Without a word, Camilla moved to the opposite end of the mahogany expanse. With slow, terrifying precision, she lowered the massive book. The heavy leather struck the polished wood directly beside Dante's designated porcelain plate. The matriarch adjusted the book's position with her fingertips, sliding it fractionally to the left, until its worn spine sat perfectly parallel to the silver butter knife. She placed the record of blood and money as though it were simply another dining utensil, a normal, expected requirement for the evening service. Only then did she lift her chin. Her dark eyes passed straight through her daughter-in-law. "The silver is crooked," the older woman noted. Her voice was smooth, devoid of any obvious malice, making the critique cut infinitely deeper. Vivienne did not argue. She did not defend her meticulous work. She simply lowered her hands, folding them perfectly in front of her dark wool dress. The faint scent of old paper and dust from the ledger mingled awkwardly with the aroma of roasted garlic drifting from the kitchen. Anger was loud. Hostility was loud. But this precise, wordless arrangement of an inheritance record meant that a silent verdict had already been reached. Dinner commenced 30 minutes later in an atmosphere thick with unvoiced tension. Dante Romano took his seat at the head of the table. He wore his tailored suit like impenetrable armor, a man accustomed to commanding a sprawling criminal empire with a single, fractional nod. Yet, the moment his eyes fell upon the ancient leather book resting casually beside his water glass, his broad shoulders stiffened. The air shifted, growing heavy with consequence. The first course was served by the estate staff in absolute silence. The faint clinking of silver forks against fine porcelain sounded like small, dangerous fractures in a sheet of ice. The husband stared at his plate. He did not ask why the vault had been opened. His mother did not wait for the second course. She wiped the corner of her mouth with a linen napkin, folded it with geometric exactness, and delivered the execution. "The elders convened this afternoon," the matriarch stated, keeping her volume at a conversational, devastating low. "The northern territories are fracturing rapidly. The syndicate requires an immediate alliance with the Moretti family to stabilize our shipping ports." The mafia boss set his fork down. The metal chimed sharply against the china. "We have secured the ports through other logistical means." "We have not," Camilla corrected instantly. She reached out with one manicured hand and tapped the dark leather cover of the book. "They demand a blood tie, a true marriage of state. To secure your succession as Don, you must annul your current arrangement. If you refuse, the council will bypass you entirely. You will forfeit the crown." The words hung over the table, chilling the remaining warmth from the room. It was a direct, inescapable ultimatum. The matriarch was publicly forcing her son to choose between his vast empire and his wife. Vivienne did not gasp. She did not drop her gaze or reach for her water glass to hide trembling hands. She simply sat perfectly still, looking across the long expanse of polished mahogany, waiting for the man she married to speak. She waited for the immediate, furious refusal that any protective partner would instinctively unleash. Dante did not meet her eyes. Instead, the powerful executive lowered his head slightly, staring blindly at the dark wood of the table, his jaw clenched, a small muscle feathering erratically beneath his skin. Slowly, his left hand drifted away from his plate, moving down toward his wrist. His fingers found the thick buckle of his expensive leather watch strap. He pulled the strap tighter. He pulled it so hard that the leather creaked in the suffocating quiet of the dining room. The metal buckle dug brutally into his flesh, leaving a deep, vivid red mark against his skin. It was a subconscious, desperate gesture of self-soothing. The physical manifestation of a man attempting to bind his own anxiety while failing to protect his family. He kept his gaze firmly anchored to the tablecloth, utterly avoiding the steady, quiet observation of the woman he had promised to cherish. Moments later, the heavy oak doors of the study clicked shut, sealing off the faint sound of crystal and silver from the dining room. Inside, the room was a sanctuary of calculated decisions, illuminated only by the muted glow of a single brass reading lamp, the air smelling faintly of cedarwood and old paper. Donna Camilla walked directly to the massive writing desk at the center of the room. She did not sit. Instead, she placed the family ledger precisely on the dark leather blotter, the heavy book landing with a dull, authoritative thud. Her manicured fingers flipped past decades of recorded births, deaths, and strategic marriages. She stopped only when she reached a blank page near the back, smoothing it flat with the palm of her hand. The marriage must be annulled by the end of the quarter, she declared. She laid out the logistics with the chilling efficiency of a corporate liquidation, a modest offshore financial settlement, a strict non-disclosure agreement, and a carefully orchestrated press leak. Dante stood by the panoramic window, watching the coastal fog roll over the iron gates of the estate. He habitually adjusted his left cufflink, twisting the silver mechanism, a nervous tell he had never quite outgrown when cornered. The man who commanded a sprawling empire built on absolute authority was now completely immobilized by a domestic choice. He did not turn around and declare his devotion. He did not slam his fist on the mahogany desk. Instead, he approached the desk slowly, his expression a mask of unreadable control, and picked up a silver mechanical pencil. "The timing is too aggressive," Dante murmured, his voice adopting the low, detached frequency he reserved for boardroom negotiations. "A sudden annulment right now shows instability. It makes the leadership look reactive." Leaning over the heavy book, Dante began drafting a transition timeline on the blank page with precise strokes of graphite. He drew a horizontal line, marking intervals for public appearances, strategic distancing, and asset reallocation. He was sketching the systematic dismantling of his own marriage, treating 7 years of shared life as a complex corporate merger that needed to be slowly, safely unwound. "We need a buffer," Dante continued, tapping the lead against the thick paper. "A phased withdrawal. If we push her out by the end of the quarter, the northern families will see it as a concession of weakness. We need at least 6 months to manage the optics." Camilla watched the pencil trace over the paper, a faint, satisfied smile touching the corners of her mouth. Her son was not defending his wife. He was negotiating the terms of her surrender. Out in the dim corridor, beyond the heavy oak doors, Vivienne stood perfectly still in the shadows, the chill of the marble seeping through her shoes. She had not come to the hallway to eavesdrop or spy. She had merely walked toward the study to fetch Dante a glass of water, an ordinary, invisible act of care she performed almost every night after stressful dinners, anticipating his exhaustion. Now she stood paralyzed, listening to the muffled cadence of her own erasure. The grand hallway's acoustics caught the low rumble of her husband's voice. "I am not throwing her to the wolves, mother." Dante's voice drifted through the thick wood, sounding incredibly tired but devoid of desperation. "I will arrange a secure apartment for her in the northern district. It is quiet, out of the immediate political sphere. We can present it to the council as a temporary separation, keeping the situation under my control." In the cold, empty corridor, Vivienne slowly raised her left hand. Her fingers traced the smooth surface of the gold wedding band on her third finger. The metal, which usually warmed to the exact temperature of her skin, suddenly felt heavy and icy against her knuckle. She listened to Dante calmly explain the logistics of her new hidden life. He detailed the private security for the northern apartment, the monthly allowance routed through a shell company, and the strict communication protocols required to maintain the illusion of their estrangement. It was not the betrayal itself that fractured her world. It was the absolute precision of his delivery. Dante's tone of voice, measured, practical, entirely devoid of emotional turbulence, was exactly the same frequency he used when coordinating high-value freight shipments across the Atlantic. He was discussing the relocation of his wife with the exact logistical detachment he applied to moving cargo. There was no anger in his voice. There was no grief. There was only the calm, bureaucratic calculation of a man managing a structural liability. The deepest wounds often arrive in silence. Vivienne closed her eyes, letting the reality wash over her. He believed he was protecting her, offering a noble compromise by hiding her at the edge of the city. He did not understand the simplest truth of loyalty. A husband who negotiates his wife's presence has already agreed to her absence. The corridor remained perfectly silent, save for the faint ticking of a clock in the distant foyer. Vivienne did not cry. She did not push open the thick doors to demand an explanation. Anger was loud. Sadness was loud. Calm meant something had already ended. She lowered her hand, her fingertips slipping away from the gold wedding band. The crystal glass of water she had intended to bring him remained untouched on a nearby console table, the condensation slowly pooling into a silent puddle on the polished wood. Turning her back on the study, Vivienne walked soundlessly down the long hallway, her footsteps perfectly measured, carrying the weight of a marriage that had just died without a single raised voice. At the end of the hall, the heavy mahogany door of the master suite clicked shut, sealing the sprawling room in absolute quiet. Vivienne did not lean against the wood. She did not slide down to the floor in a dramatic display of heartbreak, nor did she cover her face to muffle a sob. She moved with measured steps across the imported Persian rug, the thick wool absorbing the sound of her footsteps. The bedroom was a masterpiece of affluent design, dominated by a massive four-poster bed draped in charcoal silk, flanked by tall windows that looked out over the darkened cliffs. It was beautiful, immaculate, and utterly freezing. She sat on the edge of the mattress, keeping her spine perfectly straight. Her reflection caught in the grand gilded mirror opposite the bed, a composed woman in a tailored evening dress, looking exactly like the perfect mafia wife Donna Camilla demanded. Yet, beneath the polished exterior, an irreversible shift had occurred. She understood the reality of what she had just heard in the corridor. Dante had not raised his voice to defend her. He had not slammed his fist on the leather blotter and rejected his mother's ultimatum. Instead, he had asked for time. He had proposed a compromise, a secure apartment hidden away from the family's critical eyes. He wanted to keep his crown while keeping her in the shadows. The realization settled in her chest not with a sharp stab, but with the heavy, undeniable weight of a final verdict. A man who negotiated his wife's presence had already agreed to her absence. Vivienne reached for the small, silver-bound notepad resting on the marble nightstand. Dante used it to jot down late-night logistical thoughts for the syndicate. She picked up the heavy fountain pen beside it, the cool metal steadying her fingers. She did not write a letter of protest. She did not draft a plea for him to reconsider, nor did she outline a list of grievances. Such words would only validate the negotiation, suggesting there was still something left to salvage. Instead, she flipped past his tactical notes to a blank page and began to write down a simple routine. 6 a.m, wake up. Brew plain black coffee with no sugar. Open the windows to let in the salt air. Read the daily paper on the porch. Walk down to the shoreline before the town wakes. Her handwriting was elegant, steady, and deliberate. She was writing down her modest daily schedule from the coastal town where she had lived before the Romano family consumed her existence, before the armed escorts, the curated galas, and the suffocating expectations of a lineage that viewed her as a liability. The scratch of the pen against the thick paper was the only sound in the cavernous room, a quiet rhythm anchoring her back to her own identity. For years, she had contorted her life to fit into Dante's schedule, managing the invisible architecture of his estate while slowly disappearing inside it. Now, as she traced the familiar steps of a quiet, autonomous morning, she felt the invisible chains of the Romano dynasty unlatching one by one, Her impending departure no longer felt like a terrifying plunge into the unknown. It felt like a necessary breath of fresh air. Setting the pen down, Vivienne rose from the bed and walked into the cavernous master closet. The space was larger than her entire childhood apartment, illuminated by soft, recessed lighting that made the rows of clothing look like a high-end boutique. On the left side hung Dante's immaculately tailored dark suits, organized sharply by season and occasion. On the right hung the wardrobe he had systematically purchased to mold her into an acceptable Don's wife. She walked slowly down the central aisle, trailing her fingertips lightly over the fabrics. Emerald green silk gowns meant for charity galas, heavy cashmere coats designed for winter negotiations, racks of pristine designer dresses that carried the weight of the family name, each one an expensive costume for a role that had ultimately offered her no protection. These expensive garments were supposedly tokens of his devotion, yet they felt entirely hollow. They were merely beautiful apologies paid in advance, material bribes meant to excuse the emotional isolation that defined their marriage. Vivienne did not pull a single silk dress from its hanger. She had no use for the armor of the elite anymore. She moved past the evening wear, past the row of custom leather heels, and reached the very back corner of the closet. There, pushed behind a row of heavy winter coats, and forgotten by the estate's meticulous housekeepers, hung a slightly faded olive green cotton jacket. It was the jacket she had been wearing the day she first met her husband, long before he decided to elevate her to his untouchable world. She pulled the wooden hanger from the rack. The cotton felt coarse and grounded against her skin compared to the frictionless slide of expensive silk. Slipping her arms into the sleeves, she adjusted the familiar collar. The fit was a little loose, but it felt incredibly warm. It smelled faintly of old cedar rather than the heavy, expensive perfume she was required to wear at formal dinners. Wearing it, she did not look like a mafia boss's wife, dependent on the conditional protection of a syndicate. She looked like a woman who could step out into the rain and build her own fire. Turning to the velvet-lined vanity island in the center of the closet, Vivienne began a meticulous process of separation. She unclasped the heavy diamond tennis bracelet from her right wrist, setting it softly on the dark velvet tray. Next came the pearl drop earrings Donna Camilla had permitted her to wear as a conditional sign of acceptance. She aligned the jewelry with deliberate precision, ensuring every piece of the Romano wealth remained exactly where it belonged. She did not want financial compensation. She did not want a severance package or a secure apartment kept in secret. True freedom required leaving the gilded cage entirely intact, taking absolutely nothing that possessed their name. The only thing she would take was her own quiet dignity. Stepping back into the main bedroom, she found the midnight air entirely devoid of warmth. Outside the panoramic windows, the coastal wind battered against the reinforced glass of the Romano estate, a distant roar emphasizing the profound silence within. She did not turn on the chandelier. The faint, silver glow of the moon filtering through the sheer curtains provided all the illumination she required. Resting on the center of the massive mattress was a single worn item, the leather bag. It was the exact piece of luggage she had carried across the threshold of this estate years ago, its edges softened by time, the rich brown surface scarred with minor imperfections that no amount of wealth could polish away. It looked entirely out of place against the pristine white silk of the duvet. She moved toward it, leaving behind the custom silk dresses and the cashmere coats that felt like spun air. They were beautiful costumes, purchased by her husband to ensure she matched the aesthetic demands of Donna Camilla's empire. Instead, Vivienne opened a modest bottom drawer. Here, folded meticulously away from the grandeur, were the simple cotton blouses and faded wool sweaters she had owned before her name was absorbed into the dynasty. She placed the garments into the leather bag, smoothing out the wrinkles with the flat of her palm. Her hands were perfectly steady. There was no frantic rushing, no tearful hesitation. Panic belonged to those who were uncertain of their survival. She had already survived the worst of the injury when she listened to the man she loved negotiate her absence. From the bedside table, Vivienne retrieved a small glass jar. Inside lay a handful of dried rosemary seeds, harvested from the modest garden of her childhood home, long before she ever knew what a mafia syndicate was. The tiny seeds rattled softly as she turned the container over in her hands. She traced the rusted metal lid with one fingertip. They were worthless to anyone in this house, but to her, they were the only true foundation she possessed. She tucked the jar carefully between two folded sweaters to keep the glass from breaking. The action was intimate, tactile, and profoundly quiet. She did not heave a dramatic sigh or cast a sorrowful gaze around the opulent bedroom she was abandoning. The walls of this estate had only ever been a beautiful cage. One does not mourn the architecture of a prison when the door has finally swung open. Vivienne pulled the heavy brass zipper of the leather bag closed. The metallic rasp was sharp in the dead of the night, sealing a chapter of her life away with absolute finality. Gripping the worn handles, the weight of the luggage grounded her. She was no longer a political compromise waiting to be hidden in a secure apartment. With the leather bag resting quietly by the bedroom door, Vivienne walked down the sprawling corridor of the estate. The cold marble floors chilled the soles of her bare feet, but she did not quicken her pace. The mansion was asleep, completely unaware that its intricate social architecture was quietly unraveling. The tall grandfather clock at the end of the hallway ticked in a slow, rhythmic cadence, measuring out the final minutes of a marriage that had collapsed beneath the weight of inherited pride. She reached the heavy oak doors of Dante's private study. The brass handle was freezing to the touch. Pushing it open, the massive hinges glided in perfect silence, allowing her to step into the sanctuary where her husband managed his empire. The room smelled of sharp cedar and expensive whiskey. It was a space designed for unquestioned authority, filled with dark wood paneling and a massive mahogany writing desk dominating the center of the floor. Vivienne approached the desk, her footsteps making no sound on the thick Persian rug. The moonlight angled sharply through the high arched window, illuminating the polished wood. Resting precisely in the center was the leather blotter. It was dark, unblemished, and completely empty, waiting for the dawn's signature on whatever alliance the new day brought. She lifted her left hand. The gold wedding band caught the pale light, gleaming with a heavy, inescapable gravity. For years, she had worn it as a shield, believing it signified protection and mutual devotion. Now, she understood it was merely a tag of ownership, a territorial marker in a family game she refused to play. Slowly, she pinched the metal between her right thumb and forefinger. She did not close her eyes to pray or whisper a tragic goodbye to the empty room. She simply slid the heavy ring off her finger. The friction of the gold leaving her skin felt like shedding a layer of armor she no longer needed to carry. Her bare knuckle felt strangely light, exposed to the cool indoor draft for the first time in years. She lowered her hand over the desk. Vivienne placed the gold wedding band directly in the center of the leather blotter. She did not drop it. She set it down with absolute surgical precision. Adjusting the ring with the tip of her fingernail, she moved it a fraction of an inch until its dark, circular shadow aligned perfectly with the sharp, straight edge of Dante's leather-bound calendar. The geometric perfection of the placement was entirely deliberate. It left no room for misinterpretation. It was not a gesture of sudden rage, nor an impulsive act of heartbreak that could be dismissed as a temporary emotional outburst. The meticulous alignment of the ring communicated absolute, irreversible clarity. It was the calm declaration of a woman who had calculated the cost of staying and found it too expensive to bear. Vivienne withdrew her hand, folding her fingers together. The desk looked immaculate, save for the single gold circle interrupting the dark expanse of the leather blotter. She stood in the silence of the study for one long, measured breath, observing the visual proof of her liberation. There was no anger left in her chest. The rage had burned out long ago, leaving behind only the cool, sterile ash of reality. She turned her back on the mahogany desk, walking out of the study, without pulling the oak door completely shut. The slight gap left the room vulnerable to the hallway's draft, a quiet disruption of the estate's perfect order. Making her way downstairs, she slipped through the darkened corridors until she reached the back of the house. The air outside the main house was sharper than expected. November had begun to strip the warmth from the coastal winds, leaving a biting chill across the flagstone courtyard. Vivienne closed the heavy oak door of the service entrance behind her, making sure the latch caught with barely a whisper. She did not take the grand marble stairs of the front portico. Those were reserved for the dynasty. Instead, She navigated the narrow gravel path wrapping around the glass conservatory. The single leather bag rested against her hip. It carried only the absolute essentials: 2 changes of clothes, a few worn paperbacks, and the identification documents bearing her maiden name. Everything else remained upstairs, forming a silent museum of a woman who no longer existed. She knew the security rotation perfectly. Managing the estate's logistical operations had fallen entirely to her for years. She knew that at exactly 4:20 in the morning, the perimeter guards gathered near the heated garage, leaving the western wall temporarily unmonitored. The invisible labor that had kept her husband's sanctuary running flawlessly was now the precise mechanism facilitating her departure. A dense layer of sea mist clung to the dark stone walls. She tightened her grip on the strap of her bag, her eyes focused on the narrow service gate ahead. Then, a shadow detached itself from the gloom. Vivienne stopped. Standing between her and the exit was Giuseppe Bianchi. The older guard wore his heavy wool overcoat, his hands resting near his utility belt. He had worked for the family since Dante was a child. Vivienne stood perfectly still. If Giuseppe reached for his radio, the courtyard would be flooded with men in seconds. He did not move toward his communication device. His weathered eyes dropped to the worn leather bag slung over her shoulder. Slowly his gaze shifted to her left hand. He stared at the empty space where the heavy gold ring had always sat. For years, the guard had stood by the doors while the matriarch made cutting remarks about Vivienne's background. He had watched her silently bring hot coffee to the security detail during winter storms. He knew the difference between the people who demanded respect and the people who quietly earned it. The older man took one step forward, reaching into his deep coat pocket. Vivienne's posture remained completely composed. Instead of a radio, Giuseppe withdrew his hand and extended it toward her. Pinched between his thick fingers was a small, neatly folded piece of paper. Vivienne reached out and took it. She unfolded the edge just enough to catch the faint yellow glow of the perimeter lights. It was a printed schedule for the regional commuter trains departing from the lower village. He had seen the shifting architecture of her patience. Without uttering a single syllable, Giuseppe walked to the iron side gate. He grasped the heavy latch, lifted it with practiced care, and pushed the gate open into the mist. He stepped aside, leaving a clear path to the coastal road. A profound, silent acknowledgement passed between them. She did not whisper a thank you. Words would only break the safety of the quiet. She simply nodded, a slow, dignified lowering of her chin, and stepped through the threshold into the damp morning air. The coastal road leading away from the property was shrouded in pre-dawn darkness. Vivienne walked at a steady pace, the sound of the ocean waves crashing against the jagged rocks below, providing a rhythmic cadence to her departure. The deeper she moved into the salt-thickened fog, the more the imposing silhouette of the compound faded behind her. A dignified heart does not wait to be chosen once the hesitation has already spoken. At the edge of the lower town, a pre-arranged local taxi idled beneath a flickering street lamp, the exhaust plumed white in the cold air. A quiet beacon of ordinary life, waiting to carry her away from the insulated empire she had spent nearly a decade serving. Vivienne slid onto the worn vinyl seat, placing the leather bag gently beside her. The driver glanced in the rearview mirror and asked for her destination. She gave him the name of the distant northern station, printed on the schedule Giuseppe had handed her. The vehicle shifted into gear, the tires humming softly against the damp asphalt. Inside the cabin, the heater was running, blowing dry warmth into the small space. Vivienne reached out and pressed the button on the armrest, rolling the window down halfway. The cold morning sea breeze immediately rushed into the car, sharp and bracing. It tangled loose strands of hair around her face, carrying the raw, unfiltered scent of salt, pine, and wet earth. She leaned slightly toward the opening, letting the freezing air hit her cheeks, waking her completely to the reality of her new autonomy. She rested her left hand on the edge of the open window. Her thumb instinctively traced the base of her ring finger. There was no physical weight anchoring her to a dynasty that demanded her silence in exchange for her presence. Instead of the phantom grief she had expected, the absence of the metal felt remarkably light. It felt like a long-held breath finally being released. As the taxi climbed higher along the coastal highway, the horizon began to crack. The deep indigo of the night sky fractured into pale streams of gold and soft violet, reflecting across the unbroken surface of the water. She kept her hand on the window ledge, feeling the vibration of the road beneath the tires. Not once did she look back toward the iron gates or the sprawling stone walls that had once defined her existence. The future did not feel like a cage. It felt, for the first time in 8 years, like an open road. Hours later, back at the estate, Dante pushed open the heavy oak doors of his private study. The morning light had just begun to break through the towering, leaded glass windows, casting long, pale shadows across the Persian rugs. He had spent the remaining hours of the night pacing the perimeter of the property, mentally drafting the exact phrasing he would use with his wife. He had constructed a flawless argument. He would explain the temporary nature of the apartment, the strategic necessity of appeasing Donna Camilla and the council, and the absolute certainty that he would bring Vivienne back once the political tide turned in his favor. It was a compromise built on logic, on the architecture of power that he had spent his entire life mastering. He expected to find her awake, perhaps reading by the fireplace, waiting for the verdict of his meeting. Instead, the study was completely empty. The air inside the room was perfectly still, devoid of the faint scent of jasmine tea she usually brought with her in the early hours. Dante stepped deeper into the silence, his footsteps muffled by the thick wool carpet. His eyes swept past the towering bookshelves, the heavy velvet drapes, and the unlit hearth, finally settling on the massive mahogany desk in the center of the room. There, resting perfectly in the exact center of the leather blotter, was a small, unmistakable circle of metal. He stopped. The breath caught in his throat, a sharp physical halt in the quiet room. It was the gold wedding band. Dante approached the desk slowly, as if the air had suddenly turned to deep water. He stared down at the dark, smooth surface of the blotter. The ring looked incredibly small against the vast expanse of the leather. It was not discarded in anger. It was not thrown across the room or left teetering on the edge of the desk. It was placed with deliberate, terrifying precision. His hand trembled slightly as he reached out. He pinched the heavy gold band between his thumb and forefinger, lifting it into the gray morning light. It was freezing. The realization struck him with the force of a physical blow. The metal was entirely cold to the touch. If she had taken it off a moment ago in a sudden fit of rage, the gold would still hold the residual heat of her skin. But there was no warmth left. The ambient temperature of the unheated study had completely claimed it. She had not just taken it off. She had taken it off hours ago, long before the sun had even considered rising. While he was carefully constructing his political compromise, negotiating the terms of her dignity behind closed doors, she had already made her choice. Dante stood frozen, the freezing metal biting into his skin. The coldness of the ring was an undeniable timeline, proving that his calculated delay had cost him everything. The silence of the study did not feel peaceful anymore. It felt like a vacuum, pulling the oxygen from his lungs. He closed his fist around the band, the sharp edges of his own failure pressing into his palm. He turned sharply and walked out of the study, his strides long and panicked. The sprawling corridors of the Romano estate usually felt like a testament to his authority, lined with curated artwork and polished marble. Now, the silence echoing off the walls felt like an accusation. The morning routines that usually hummed in the background, the quiet opening of curtains by the staff, the soft murmur of footsteps in the kitchen, the faint aroma of cinnamon and dark roast coffee, were entirely absent. The house had memorized its schedule, but it had forgotten its heart. Dante pushed open the double doors to the master suite. The room was immaculate. The massive bed was perfectly made, the heavy duvet smoothed without a single crease. It was as if she had never slept there. He crossed the room and pulled open the heavy wooden doors to her expansive walk-in closet, his chest tightening with a sudden, desperate hope that this was merely a temporary retreat to another wing of the compound, a quiet protest that could still be managed. The lights flickered on automatically, illuminating rows of pristine luxury. Every single custom silk dress, every tailored winter coat, and every pair of designer heels he had ever purchased for her remained perfectly aligned. He opened the velvet-lined jewelry drawers, the diamond necklaces, the pearl earrings, the expensive watches. They were all untouched. She had left his wealth exactly where she found it. Then he noticed the empty space on the top shelf. The leather bag was gone, the worn, simple piece of luggage she had carried with her on the day she arrived at the estate was missing. Dante's gaze dropped to the floor, scanning the polished cedar planks. Deep in the back corner, pushed slightly behind a row of immaculate stilettos, lay a single worn-out house slipper. It was faded, the fabric frayed at the edges from years of quiet, invisible use, while she walked the cold stone floors of the estate late at night. He knelt down, the fabric of his tailored trousers pulling tight, and reached into the shadow. He picked up the old slipper. It was practically weightless. Compared to the heavy gold and crystal that surrounded him, it was a completely useless, forgotten domestic object. Yet, as he held it in his large hands, Dante felt the final, undeniable weight of her absence. She had not taken his money, his name, or his protection. She had taken the very essence of herself, the quiet, dependable labor, the silent grace, the original identity she had brought into his world. He sat on the cold floor of the closet, surrounded by millions of dollars of untouched silk and diamonds, clutching the frayed slipper to his chest. There was no one to yell at, no enemy to threaten, no deal to negotiate. Anger was loud. Panic was loud. This absolute, echoing calm meant that his marriage had already ended. Dante lowered his head in the perfect, echoing silence, finally understanding that his empire was nothing but a beautiful, empty cage. Eventually, he retreated downstairs. The morning light filtering into the study felt sharp, clinical, and completely devoid of the quiet warmth that usually accompanied the early hours at the estate. Dante stood perfectly still behind his desk, his eyes locked on the leather blotter. The heavy gold wedding band sat exactly where he had found it, a silent boundary separating the life he commanded from the reality he had just inherited. The heavy oak doors parted without a knock. Camilla swept into the room, the pristine lines of her tailored wool suit radiating the quiet triumph of a woman who had just secured an empire. In her hands, she carried a delicate porcelain cup and saucer, steam rising from the espresso. She moved with the deliberate grace of a queen surveying a conquered territory, her gaze sweeping past the empty spaces before landing on her son. "It minimizes the political toll," she noted coolly. "You made the correct decision. The elders have been notified that the transition will be seamless. Order has been restored." She extended her hand, her manicured fingers brushing his sleeve in a rare gesture of approval. It was the touch of a political ally, not a mother. Dante did not pull away. He simply looked at the hand resting on his arm, then up to the composed face of the woman who had demanded the sacrifice of his wife. The air grew dense with the unsaid realization that he had traded his soul for a ledger. He reached out, closing his fingers around the porcelain handle. The heat of the ceramic pressed into his skin, but he did not bring it to his lips. Instead, he turned toward the edge of the desk, where an ancient, meticulously cultivated bonsai tree rested in a shallow pot. It was a prize piece, a symbol of generational control. Without breaking eye contact, Dante slowly tilted the cup. The dark, scalding liquid poured out in a deliberate stream, sinking into the carefully raked soil of the bonsai. The roots hissed faintly under the sudden, bitter heat. The scent of roasted coffee beans and scorched earth filled the heavy silence. He poured until the cup was empty, the final drops staining the white stones at the base. "Order," Dante repeated, his voice dangerously quiet, stripped of its usual commanding resonance. He set the empty cup back onto its saucer with a sharp click that echoed off the mahogany walls. "You have your empire. Do not come into my sanctuary and pretend it is a victory." Camilla's serene expression cracked, a flicker of genuine uncertainty crossing her features. She looked at the ruined soil, then at the absolute, terrifying coldness in her son's eyes. For the first time, Dante was not looking at his mother. He was looking at a stranger. He did not raise his voice or order her out. He simply turned his back, leaving her standing in the center of the vast study. The matriarch waited for the customary deference, but it never came. With a stiff, measured turn, she exited the room, the heavy doors closing with a definitive thud. The silence that rushed back in was the absolute, suffocating quiet of a kingdom that had lost its heart. By 8 o'clock that evening, the grand dining hall was prepared with the same flawless precision it had maintained for decades. The mahogany table gleamed under the crystal chandeliers, reflecting the flickering flames of a dozen tall candles. A fire burned steadily in the massive stone hearth, casting a deceptive glow across the cold marble floors. Yet, the vast room felt like a cavern, echoing with an emptiness that no amount of light or heat could dispel. Dante sat at the head of the table, his tailored suit feeling like armor worn in peacetime. Before him sat a multi-course dinner of roasted meats and vintage wine, presented on silver platters by the silent staff. The choreography of the household continued flawlessly, an automated machine running on the momentum of invisible routines that Vivienne had established. But the chair opposite him, the chair where she had sat just 24 hours earlier, silently observing the political theater of his family, remained completely empty. The staff moved like ghosts, refilling his crystal goblet and retreating to the shadows. Dante did not touch his fork. His gaze was fixed on the vacant space across the polished wood. For years, he had believed his wealth and status were the foundation of their life, assuming absolute security was enough to sustain a marriage. He was wrong. The security was a cage, and the wealth was a gilded lock. He reached out, his long fingers closing around a heavy silver salt shaker near his plate. The metal was cool to the touch, grounding him in the quiet reality of the present moment. Slowly, deliberately, he pushed the silver object forward across the dark mahogany. It made a soft, continuous scraping sound, a low friction that cut through the agonizing silence. He pulled it back, he pushed it forward again. The repetition was mechanical, hypnotic. The silver sliding across the wood became the only sound in the cavernous room, a metronome counting the seconds of his hollow victory. He had negotiated to keep his crown, compromising to appease a ledger of names and alliances. In doing so, he had successfully preserved an empire that suddenly meant nothing. He looked at the perfectly cooked food cooling on his porcelain plate. He remembered the evenings when his wife would sit across from him, asking simple, grounding questions about his day, anchoring his volatile world with her steady presence. She had never asked about the syndicate. She had only ever asked for his time, and he had treated that request as an inconvenience. Dante slid the salt shaker one final time, stopping it halfway across the table, right at the invisible boundary line between his space and hers. The silver object sat there, isolated and utterly useless. The realization did not arrive with a burst of dramatic grief. It settled into his bones like a deep, paralyzing winter frost. He commanded hundreds of men and held the fear of an entire city. Yet, sitting alone at a table built for a dynasty, surrounded by the finest luxury blood could buy, he had never felt more completely powerless. The empire was secure, but the house was dead. 42 days had passed since the heavy iron gates of the Romano estate clicked shut behind Vivienne. Dante had reigned over his newly secured empire for 6 weeks, yet the victory tasted entirely of ash. The sprawling glass and stone mansion had become a mausoleum, amplifying the hollow reality of his choice. The schedules were perfect. The ledgers were balanced. But the oppressive stillness eventually drove him outward. His armored black SUV navigated the winding, salt-battered roads of a distant northern province, transitioning from manicured urban perfection to wild coastal brush. He parked under a cluster of ancient wind-bent pines near the edge of Matteo Silva's botanical nursery. Inside his vehicle, the air was climate-controlled and sterile. Outside, the world was messy, vibrant, and alive. Dante sat in the dim interior, gripping the steering wheel as he watched the scene near the fogged glass of a large greenhouse. Vivienne was there. She was not wearing custom silk or restrictive jewelry. Instead, she wore a simple, faded linen shirt and heavy denim, dark soil smudging her wrists. She leaned over a staging table, helping a kind-faced older man, Matteo, lift a massive terracotta flower pot filled with wintering hydrangeas. As they set the heavy pot down, Matteo said something that made her pause. Then, Vivienne laughed. Even through the soundproof glass, the visual impact of that laugh struck Dante physically. Her shoulders relaxed completely. Her eyes crinkled with an unforced warmth he had not witnessed in years. It was a lightness no amount of syndicate money or high society status had ever provided her. She was performing manual labor in the freezing wind, yet she looked undeniably radiant. Sitting in his dark cage, Dante finally understood the absolute scale of his failure. He could dictate the fate of a criminal dynasty, but he could not produce that simple, unguarded smile on his wife's face. Donna Camilla had convinced him that preserving the family legacy was his ultimate duty. Looking at Vivienne flourishing in the sea salt, Dante realized the brutal truth. He was not the one who had preserved an empire. He was the one permanently exiled from a home. The The silence inside the vehicle broke as Dante killed the engine. He stepped out into the biting wind, the crunch of his polished leather shoes against the crushed seashells announcing his arrival. Vivienne looked up from the wooden staging table. There was no sudden gasp, no dropped tools, and no panic. The physical beat was devastatingly ordinary. She simply set her shears down with careful precision and wiped her hands on a towel. The expression staring back at him contained no triumph and absolutely no hesitation. It was the calm, measured look of a woman observing a stranger from a long-forgotten past. "Dante," she said softly, her voice steady against the crashing waves. She gestured toward a weathered wooden bench overlooking the gray ocean. Matteo gave a respectful nod to Vivienne and quietly retreated into the greenhouse, recognizing the boundary without needing a word. Vivienne walked to a small outdoor sink, rinsed the dirt from her hands, and filled 2 glass tumblers with cold tap water. She placed one in front of Dante. Condensation immediately wept down the sides of the cheap glass. A man accustomed to negotiating over aged scotch in crystal decanters, Dante stared at the tap water as if it were an alien artifact. He gathered his practiced authority and began his pitch. His tone was desperate but controlled. He told her Camilla's influence was neutralized. He promised to buy her a new estate, a different life, far away from the syndicate's grind, where she would never be subjected to an ultimatum again. Vivienne did not interrupt. She let him finish his grand declarations, her gaze fixed on the turbulent horizon. She did not point out that his promises were exactly what he had failed to deliver when she stood beside him, waiting for his defense. When the silence stretched, she traced the rim of her cold glass. "You are offering to build me a better room inside the exact same house, Dante," she said, her voice carrying the slow rhythm of the tide, "but I have already walked out the door." He shifted forward, instinctively reaching across the table to take her hand. Vivienne smoothly pulled back, wrapping her fingers securely around her glass. The boundary she established was physical, absolute, and unbridgeable. "I didn't leave because I wanted you to chase me," she explained, her tone devoid of malice. "I didn't pack my bags to force you into an epiphany. I left because I realized that love is rarely lost in one terrible moment. It slowly disappears through ordinary choices, and your choices proved that I was already completely alone." Dante absorbed the quiet devastation of her words. He looked at her bare hands, noting the permanent absence of the gold band he kept locked in his desk drawer. He looked past her, toward the vast horizon she faced every day. There were no walls here. There were no ledgers, no contracts, and no toxic allegiances to manage. Slowly, Dante stood up. Wealth, status, and the fearsome reputation of his name meant absolutely nothing in this quiet space. He could not barter for her peace, because her peace no longer required his provision. Without offering another empty promise, he turned and walked back across the crushed seashells toward his dark, isolated world. He had spent a lifetime sacrificing his soul to inherit an empire of stone and ambition, only to learn that a home is built from something else entirely. And for Vivienne, he had simply arrived too late.